So I'm very excited to be here with you today. I knew of Lawrence Livermore Laboratory for a long time. I got my PhD at Berkeley, but I had never come here. And so there's legends about the lab going back to the 50s. And I'm glad finally to see the real thing and the real people who work in it. And it's a very lively and interesting community. I'll be talking about one of the projects that goes on in the lab. I'll be very happy to go deeper into any one of the topics I'll touch upon today with any one of you who is interested. And if you wish to ask questions during my talk, please feel free to do so. I think it should be an informal conversation. I don't want to keep you just listening to me. So this is a project called Visipedia, which I am running together with Serge Belongi, who is at Cornell Tech. Somebody's talking to me here. Okay. Okay, so it's called Visipedia. So let me start with an example that motivates the idea. Okay, so this is a pigeon. All of you know it. And so there is nothing to be discovered here. However, one day I was sitting at some cafe in Italy giving breadcrumbs to the pigeons, and I started thinking about what is that thing? What is that structure? And I realized that there was a lot I didn't know about pigeons. And what I do when I don't know something is I go home and now I pick up my iPhone and I type something into Wikipedia and I try to figure out what is that thing. Trouble is I didn't know the name of that structure in the first place, and so I didn't know what to type into Wikipedia. And I didn't realize that until I went home and I started searching for it, and surely it must be there, it must be there. And it took me 20 minutes to find out. And so one place I went to was the page on pigeons, and then I went to the page on beaks. And after having actually to read through the fine print of all the article, I found a few words that made me click on the right link and finally got to the correct page. It took me about 20 minutes. So it didn't feel right. So the web is supposed to have all the information that ever was put out by man. All that we understand about the world should be there. I should be able to, it's at my fingertips. This is what, that's a party line. And here I was on such a simple question. I was having trouble. And there is nothing that was inherently complicated about the question. If somebody knew about birds and had been sitting next to me, I could have just said, what is that? And they would have told me it's a seer of a pigeon. So what went wrong? And what went wrong is I didn't know the words, and there is no way to formulate visual queries on the web. So it works well with words, it doesn't work well with images. It turns out that images are 95% of all content on all hard drives, and including the web. And so I call it the dark matter of the web. It's taking most of space, and we cannot reach it. We cannot see it. So here is another example. My father-in-law knows that I like to collect mushrooms in the woods, and I like to cook them, and I consider them a delicacy. And he was walking on Long Island in a park, and he saw this one, and of course, he could not identify it, and so he sent me a photograph from his iPhone. And as soon as I didn't quite know what it was, but as soon as I saw the picture, I thought, this doesn't look good. I'd better call him up immediately and tell him, don't do anything stupid, just leave it there. And so I did, and and it turns out that it's indeed, so my hunch was it's a poisonous mushroom, but in order to find out what it was, when I went to Wikipedia, I know how to search for mushrooms, and I couldn't find it. And I had to call up a cousin of mine in Italy. It was still, in time for Europe to be still up. I sent him the picture, and he knew. But if you go to Wikipedia, there is no way to identify a mushroom from the landing page on mushrooms. And if you read down the article, it tells you, well, if you wish to identify a mushroom, buy yourself a field guide. And I don't know how many of you have had the experience of using a field guide to identify a plant or a bird. It just doesn't work. And now we know why it doesn't work. It's because it's a tree search, and if you take the wrong turn at any branch, which is very easy to do, because the questions are not as sharp, you're lost. And you have no way to know where you make a mistake. So that's a big problem. And yet, even in this case, the information is there. And so if you go to Amanita pantherina, you will find that it's a very poisonous mushroom. By no means you should eat it. And by the way, at the end of the article, it says it's considered a delicacy in China. So you should. And so I've yet to understand how to think about it. Okay, so so this is the first point I want to make, that visual queries are not well served today, and each one of you knows it in some domain of science that you're active in. You have to deal with images, and somehow machines and images don't get along very well, and so that's a problem. There is another problem that is related, and it's this one. So another little story. I was walking in Yellowstone 3 years ago. I find the carcass of a big animal eaten by the wolves, I think. And I'm trying to guess, is it a deer, is it an elk? And I pick up a long bone, this long, and I think, well, maybe this is a femur. And again, what does a femur of an elk look like? And so look it up on the iPhone. But there is no way, because Wikipedia has the femur of a human, understandably. It's from Gray's Anatomy, and it's not hyperlinked to anything else. And again, yet the information is there. There are people who lecture on comparative anatomy throughout the world, and they relate birds, mammals, ungulates, carnivores, and they know all of these things. It's simply that experts don't take the time to type and hyperlink all of this visual information into Wikipedia because it's not well supported, and it would be very boring for each picture of each femur of each species to have to mark out all the little landmarks. Just because you know it, you're not willing to spend the time to do it. It has to be made easier for experts to give us our knowledge, or if you flip it around, it has to be possible for machines to ask the right questions from experts and to learn from experts and get the knowledge out of people's heads and into a format that is manageable by machines. So this is something that is very important. So I hope I convinced you that there is a big problem, so where we typically don't think about it, and that one of the items is how do we gather information from experts and how do we make sense of it? And how do we know that somebody is an expert? How do we trust them? So the application we have in mind, or somehow a driving motivation for our work, is this idea that we take a picture of something, and just by the fact that the picture has been taken, it all becomes clickable because it's semantically, each part is semantically meaningful, and then I can touch a certain position in the picture and then get to the Wikipedia page. There's one possible incarnation. I'll talk about another couple of ways of looking at this problem that look different, but in fact have the same ingredients. But what is happening is that we have a world of knowledge, and it's either written knowledge like Wikipedia on the left side, or it's in the heads of experts. And on the right-hand side of your picture, you have users with visual queries, and they want to know something. What galaxy is this? Which plant has this leaf? What's this animal? And all of that. And we have these questions in mind every day. So what we want to understand is how to build a bridge between the questions and the answers. And we think that this is a very interesting and deep set of problems. And so I want to tell you about some of our ideas and that go deep in one specific area of our work. So how do we make it happen? Now, my background is in computer vision. And in my discipline, there are lots of people who now would raise their hand and say, well, we're working on this, and this is what we're doing. Think you're starting with all the possible images on the web. It should be possible, if you have the right statistics for a combination of computer vision, machine learning, software, to identify all the corresponding bits between these different images. So it should be possible for the right piece of software that is smart enough, and this is what we're working on as a field, as computer vision, to go out and find all the landmarks in all the pictures, find correspondences, link them together. And so it should be possible with the right software to build a hyperlinked structure that connects all the pictures in the world and encodes implicitly visual knowledge. At that point, it becomes very easy for an expert to come along and label a few of the images. And by virtue of the fact that the images are all hyperlinked together, that information that the expert is providing us will propagate out to all the images in the world. So this is what a computer vision person is working on today. Now, once a user comes along, then the picture of a user instantly gets processed. The same landmarks are recognized because by now you have automata that have become very good at recognizing these different landmarks. And once you have recognized the landmarks, by virtue of the fact that they are connected with the corresponding ones in the annotated data set, then you get a link to the labels, the words, and then you can use those words for a search or as the relevant page comes along. Now, if you think that this is future speak, it cannot be done, and so on, it's not true. So already 10 years ago from my lab, this is a page from Rob Fergus's thesis, the first experiments that show that this is possible were done. And this is in a very tame environment. So what was the experiment? This was collect hundreds of pictures of motorcycles in this case, and we repeated it with many other categories from Google Images. So you type motorcycle, and after that you let the right piece of software, the right statistical machine learning vision collection of routines chew on the images, and corresponding parts get identified. And so you see here the front wheels have a yellow circle, the back wheels have a green circle, the tank is a gray circle, etc. The system figures out what are the relevant bits, but there is a lot of extraneous stuff in these images, but the system is able to connect just the parts that correspond to each other. And then it has a model for each one of these parts, and it knows where the parts are with respect to each other, what are the covariances, and that's what we call a categorical model. That's what that represents what a motorcycle is. The Platonic view of a motorcycle is a certain collection of parts in a certain relationship with certain appearances. So this can be done, and after our work, has been an enormous amount of interest for visual categorization. And so now, if you go to a computer vision conference, at least half of the conference or 2/3 are about visual categorization. And so we're now at a point where, for example, pedestrians, this is work by Pedro Felsenswald out of Brown University, pedestrians can get detected 90–95% of the time, depending on the quality of the pictures. And so the algorithms are good. Faces, as you know from buying cameras and so on, can be detected, and from Facebook, can be detected very well. And we're moving on to thousands of categories. And so the latest results, this is from a paper by Jeff Hinton and his collaborators. The latest papers attempt to label all the things that you see in a certain image. And so these are simple images. Here you have a mite, and so the system says mite, and it says black widow, cockroach, so it's in the ballpark. It says here container ship, lifeboat, and then amphibian, but with very low confidence. And the third one, so there's a clearly difficult one, but it says motor scooter, God knows how it got it, leopard, and so on. So now we have come to the point where, by a combination of various ideas, we can label images quite well. So that part of computer vision is starting to work, and so all of you know the difference between someone from a university lab saying it works well, and then you have to go and build it and it doesn't work. So, but we know how to think about this kind of problems, and we can start being serious about them. But I would like to come back to something I was talking about before. We need to be able to harvest information from humans. Human experience is fundamental, and it's what we want to collect. You cannot do everything by purely unsupervised learning from the statistics of images. And so here is an example. So in this case, if you wanted to label the throat, which is a very relevant point in the human body, there's nothing in the statistics of an image to tell you that that place in the neck is a special place. The only reason why we know about it is that we can cut up bodies and know what is inside, right? And so, so the world is awash with useful bits of visual information. This is from the park rangers in Florida, in Louisiana, to help people identify the ivory-billed woodpecker and distinguish it from different species that look similar. This is from a manual on locomotive engines. And so if you think of it, the world is full of niches of visual expertise where people know an enormous amount, and we need to get all of that out and into computers. Now, the fact is, the visual information is often confusing, and even experts don't agree. And I became aware of this when I joined Caltech 15 years ago, maybe 20 plus years ago. I collaborated with a bunch of people who had the first images from the Magellan mission. It had mapped Venus to a level of resolution that was unimaginable at the time. They were all happy, and then one day, after sobering up from the champagne, they realized, well, now we have 150 CDs full of images of Venus. What do we do with them? And so they started annotating them one by one for volcanoes. At the time, the question was, what's the geology of Venus? And so we became involved. We started helping them build a machine learning system, computer vision, to detect these volcanoes. And it would never work quite well enough. Like, we would detect 80% of volcanoes, not more, and how is it possible? And one day I thought, let's take the experts. There were two experts, husband and wife, two geoplanetologists. Let's put them in different rooms and let's ask them to label these images with volcanoes separately. And lo and behold, we saw that they agreed 80% of the time. So the ground truth we were getting was 80% correct. So I realized that even experts sometimes are unsure, although often they're extremely confident. And this is also true for the pathologist who is going to explore your polyps and all of that. And so it's a bit of a scary thought, but wouldn't it be nice if every pathological slice could be assessed by a number of different doctors or experts, and then which one do you pay attention to? They are different. Well, you have to find a way to combine their knowledge and find the Platonic truth, or at least know that whatever truth you have has a certain error bar, and be aware of that. Okay, so just to have an overall picture of what's going on, here is Wikipedia or whatever body of word knowledge we have, and here are the users who are asking questions. And so we would like to build this centralized clearinghouse that is able to map visual queries to knowledge, and it's able to manage a number of different resources. And let's go through resources. So you have databases on the web that are partially annotated, and so you want to use those. You want to capture that information. You have automata. You have computer vision programs coming from Caltech, Berkeley, MIT, and so on. That can do companies that can do some of the work. You have experts, and the experts are many. They may or may not agree, but certainly they give you valuable information, and you want to capture that as well. You can hire human annotators and train them quickly to do a job that may not be as good as one of the experts, but it's still very valuable. So it's more visual systems that you can hire. And we often use the Amazon Mechanical Turk, and some of you may have used it for you. I see people nodding in the room. So for those of you who don't know, Amazon Mechanical Turk is a place that Amazon created where you can post little jobs, like you have 1,000 images and you want someone to look through them and say if there is a bird in the images, or if there is a crater in the images, or anything like that. And there are hundreds of thousands of people who are willing to do these jobs over the world. And so the great thing is you can post 1,000 images or even 100,000 images and get them labeled in a night. It's quite amazing how much work you can get done. But can you trust these labels? And if you have to check them, then you might as well have done the job yourself. And so how do you use this resource in the right way? And yet there is information. And there is one more component. It's people like me, computer vision scientists, who build the software and who learn from all of these interactions how to do it. And so there are at least 4 different classes of people and then a set of machines, and all of these have to work together. And so this clearinghouse here, so what I should say is there is no oracle here. Nobody owns the truth. There are only opinions. The experts, how good are they? So there are opinions. And how good are computer vision systems? Not very good, I can promise. And how good are annotators? Also somewhat unreliable. So what is the truth? And so this central clearinghouse has to figure out what's the truth. Where is the information? How do we put it together in a way? And if we do our job right, then this would be possible. A bit like Wikipedia, which benefits from lots of different opinions and in some way on average is most often right. Okay? And so we'd like to systematize that and make it as well-founded as possible. Okay, so I've given you a little bit of an overview of the project, and where I will spend most of my time today is going down this way and seeing what happens with annotators, and going down this way and seeing what happens with the experts. How do we get information from these people, and how do we know that information is reliable? So the first piece of work I'll talk about is mostly from Peter Vellinder's thesis. And here is the question that brought us to think about this. In order to work on Visipedia, we wanted to have some domain, maybe narrow, where there is a lot of visual expertise involved, and there are lots of enthusiastic people around the world who would be willing to work with us and help us think about the system. And so we decided that birds would be it. And so there are lots of bird watchers. They're really passionate about their birds. Discriminating different birds is very difficult, and yet there are lots of people who are interested in doing so. There is one way to reach all the bird watchers in the world, which is to talk to the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, which is the premier lab of ornithology in the world, and they know everything and everybody refers to them, so it's easy to somehow get out there. And ornithologists or bird watchers are typically technologically savvy. They own big cameras, they spend lots of money on computers to store their pictures, and so we will be able to access them through the web. So we thought it would be a great gymnasium for our ideas, and so we set off collecting pictures of 200 species of birds because we wanted to build an automated or semi-automated system for discriminating birds one from the other. That was our goal a few years ago. And so here are pictures of a bird called Indigo Bunting. It turns out that the Indigo Bunting has an almost twin, a bird that is almost unrelated in the taxonomy, but is very similar, and it's called blue-grouse beak. And so here you have, in fact, pictures of both Indigo Buntings and blue-grouse beaks, and it's not easy to tell which is which unless you're trained to look at the details. So the way we downloaded our pictures was typing the names of the birds into flickr.com, both the English name and the Latin name, and then we get lots of different pictures. So if you type pelican, you get boats called the Pelican, restaurants called the Pelican, and you also get the birds. And so after you get all of these pictures, you've got to filter out the pictures that are not relevant. And so these are pictures collected with the tag Indigo Bunting, and you see that there are some mitts that are Indigo Bunting mitts and bags that are Indigo Bunting bags and so on. And so you want to kill them, to take them out of the collection. And so you hire these mechanical Turkers, and you go from 2,000 images down to maybe 500 that are the good ones. Now, if you look at these pictures, which ones are the Indigo Buntings? And so if you ask 4 people, you get different points of view. So everybody agrees that this nice, clean side view is an Indigo Bunting. Everybody has enough information that they can do it. Everybody agrees that on the right-hand side, the bottom right, the bag is not an Indigo Bunting. But in between, there are many cases that are unclear because the bird is not. So it turns out that this pattern on the wing is what gives it away. And so in the bottom, in the middle, you have a blue-grouse beak, and you see that the pattern on the wing is different from the Indigo Bunting, and the beak is more robust than the Indigo Buntings. Okay, so now what do you do? And so the first knee-jerk reaction is, well, let's ask an odd number of people, and then we take a majority vote. And we have to live with that. And this is, you laugh, but this is the state of the art somehow in this field. So what do you do? And so let's remember that there are 2 types of errors you can make. There are false alarm errors, which is when it's not the thing you're looking for, you say yes. And there are miss errors or force reject errors when it's the thing you want and you say no. Now, for the Indigo Bunting collection, we took the time with the bird watcher to go through all the pictures, double-check them, to the point that we were almost convinced that we had them all right, which means that probably 3 or 4% were wrong. So we have a ground truth, and we send it out on the web, and this is the result we get. Each blue dot here corresponds to 1 annotator who looked at 20 or more pictures. And on the vertical axis, you have the percent of pictures that were correctly labeled, that contained indigo buntings and were correctly labeled indigo bunting. So that's a percent detection rate. And on the x-axis, on the y-axis is hits. On the x-axis is the rate of correct rejection. So the percentage of non-bunting pictures that were labeled as no's. Now, as you can see, the annotators are all over the place. Okay, so those of you who are familiar with ROC curves, and probably half of you are, the x-axis is flipped with respect to what you're used to. Okay, so the best is the top right corner in this case, it's not the top left corner. Now, if you put down equal error rate curves, you see that there are some people who are between 15 and 6% error, a few more people who are between 30 and 15, and then a few people who are about chance. But they're not, at a given level of error, they're not all the same. What's the difference? Well, the top right corner, so these are the competent annotators, the ones you would always want to have. We call bots the ones there, and so the rumor is that some people are so devious, they prefer to spend a lot of time writing software to answer automatically with a random coin to our questions rather than spend the time and clicking on the questions themselves. But everybody has their source of fun. But these are people whose work is uncorrelated with the contents of the images. Then there are those we call optimists who typically say yes. And then, as you may imagine, there are pessimists who typically say no. But not all pessimists are bad annotators. Look at this one. This is on the 30% error rate, which is still informative. And look at these ones. So again, these ones are pessimists, but they do incredibly well. So you shouldn't average together pessimists and optimists in a majority vote. If two optimists say no, it's a very strong signal that there is no indigo bunting, etc. Then there are a few that we call adversaries. And so I always tell my students, oh, these are the Berkeley students who are trying to screw up your data collection process. But once you figure out that somebody is an adversary, you just flip the bits that they give you, and it's perfectly informative. And so if you could figure it out, you beat them at their game. Okay, so how do we make use of this information? What's the right way to think about it? And so let me tell you how we view it. So there is a variable, a binary variable, z sub I. So the image index is I, and z sub I tells us if the indigo bunting is in the picture or not. It's 1 bit. The image, which is 1,000,000 pixels, is I sub I. It comes from that bit. Is the indigo bunting there or not? Plus an enormous number of other variables. What was the weather on that day? How far were you when you photographed the bird? Were you at the same level or were you below it? Was it flying along the branch? And all of those things. I'm not interested in those variables. I'm interested in Z. But I've got to deal with them because the only thing I can look at is the image. I cannot look at the variable itself. So the variable 1 bit z sub I got convolved into an enormous amount of garbage, and I now have to deal with a megabyte. Now, what happens at this point? Well, I look at the picture, and let's think about the best possible bird watcher. What will they do? They will ignore all the water, branches, clouds, and so on. They will focus on the bird, and they will look at the head, and they will look at the shape of the beak. They will look at the color of the plumage. They will look at the shape of the legs, etc. So they extract a small vector, maybe a 10-dimensional vector of variables, and those are the parameters of the bird that they're looking at. So they measure some quantities from the bird, and those quantities will allow the best bird watcher to decide, classify the bird as something, indigo bunting or not. So you may think, so for now let's think of xi as a 1-dimensional variable, just to make our life easy. And so if you think of xi there must be 2 class conditional densities on xi. The green curve is the probability distribution of xi when the bird is there, and the red curve is when the bird you're looking for is not there. And so how could you possibly decide? Well, it's simple. You have a threshold on xi, and then if your signal is above threshold, you say yes. If it's below threshold, you say no. That's very simple, and all of us know about it. And so let's think about what happens when one image is observed, then a certain value xi is observed. In this case, it's a very low value because the image is clearly not an Indigo Bunting. Now, we need one more step, because not everybody is the ideal observer. All the observers we will hire will be non-ideal observers, and so the measurements in their head will be corrupted. And so let's call them Yij, where I is the index of the image and J is the index of the observer. And each observer has some noise in their head that corrupts their measurements. What is that noise? Well, it's caused by their level of attention, by where do they focus, by how well do they know the colors, and all of that. And so they will produce measurements that are akin to the measurements of the ideal observer, but not around the ideal measurement. And if you have a bad observer, the spread will be much larger, and that's the cause of the errors. So here we have an image of a good image of a blue-rose bee, an Indigo Bunting, and here we have an ambiguous image that nobody would be able to classify. And so these three observers will have different distributions of the variable x, and so some of them will find it easier than others in discriminating between the images containing Indigo Buntings or not. Now, how do we account for the optimists and pessimists? And so I'm sure that a few of you have already thought about that. It's a matter of where you place the threshold. And so if you insist on the threshold being very high, then you're a pessimist. And unless all the evidence is in favor of saying yes, you will say no. And vice versa, you will be an optimist if a little bit of evidence is enough to make you happy and to say yes. Or you can be somebody in between, more balanced person, and you will decide 50-50 for the two. Okay, so far we've seen that in the head of the annotator, at least in our model, there are two variables. One is the amount of incompetence, that's the sigma, and one is the bias, that's a tau. There is one more variable, and that captures the idea that we discussed before about experts. How come experts disagree? Well, because they have, either because truly the signal is ambiguous, which is explained now by this diagram, or because they were trained in different ways. And so let's see how that works. Now, the variable x is going to be two-dimensional. Remember that x is the measurements that someone takes to take a decision, to make a decision. And so let's suppose, and make it practical, that we are trying to discriminate between seagulls and hawks. And so some of us think of the vertical variable, the color of the plumage. And so some of us know that seagulls are gray, white, gray, black, white, gray, black, no hue, while hawks are all brown. Okay? And so you have a vertical axis going from gray to brown, and if it's high, then it's a hawk, and it's low, it's a seagull. But then you can look at the shape of the beak, and seagulls have an almost straight beak, and hawks have a hooked beak that is more robust. And so that would be the horizontal axis, the shape of the beak. And so you can also discriminate between seagulls and hawks by looking at the beak. And then you could use a third variable, which is webbed feet versus clawed feet. Okay, so these are very clear variables. Now, some of us will use a threshold, a discriminating surface this way, horizontal. We'll use color. Some of us will use a vertical surface, and some of us will use both and have a diagonal surface, which is, of course, the best one. Okay, so the point is there is a surface, a classifier in the head of our annotators, and the parameters of which we call Wi, or Wj, sorry. And so this is the third thing that is in the head of the annotator. So there is incompetence, there is bias, and there is the school of thought, the W. So how do they come to a conclusion? Okay, so here is the model that we decided to use. And so on the left, you have a variable Zi, that is the one that we would like to know. And on the right, you have the measurable Lij, which is the bit that they give us, yes or no. And so we'd like from that bit Lij to go back and back out Zi. And those of you who have worked with machine learning, you know that the modern point of view is that if you have lots of latent variables, namely variables that affect the measurements but you cannot measure, but you can model, then it usually pays off to have priors on those variables and estimate those variables as part of the process. And even if you're not interested in those variables, that will yield a better measurement of Zi. So if we did have for each annotator the parameters of incompetence, school of thought, and bias, we would know how to use the information they give us in the best possible way. Conversely, if we had the ground truth, we knew the Zi's and we knew how they labeled, we could estimate those variables. Unfortunately, we don't know the ground truth and we don't know those variables. But in the last 10 years, people have learned how to estimate those latent variables simultaneously with the ground truth. And one way to think about it is a two-step process, one in which you assume the variables, you take average values that you are confident with, and you estimate Zi. Once you have the Zi, you go back and you estimate the variables. And once you have the variables, you go back and estimate Zi. And it turns out that if you do things right, you're guaranteed to converge somewhere. Now, you don't necessarily converge to the global optimum, but you restart it a few times, and you do all the nice things that many people in the room know how to do, and you get the best possible solution you could possibly get. So does this whole thing work, and is it worth it? And so I want to take you through a few experiments. So, so this is the comparison on that data set with the data I showed you of a majority vote, and that's the green line, and the model. If you vary the number of annotators that you employ, and it's intuitive that the more annotators you employ, the fewer mistakes you will make. And what you can see is that the error rate, which is the vertical axis, is much lower if you use the quantities properly. Now, if, for example, if you're happy with a 20% error rate, which is not great, but it's what you probably should settle for between 15 and 20 in this task, with the model you can get it with 6 annotators on average. And if you don't use the model, well, there is no number of annotators that can get it to you using the majority vote. Okay? So remember that this is a very difficult task, a task that all of you found difficult here in the room. Okay? So if it's an easy task, namely to say, is there a dog in the picture, the majority will work fine, because all the humans will work in the same way. So here we're talking about a situation where expertise varies a lot amongst the different people. Okay. Now, let me skip this one. So we have a number of synthetic experiments to validate the method. And so we had this set of ellipses. And what we found is, because the concern is, well, there is a lot of gimcrackery in the numerics of the estimation algorithms. And do you trust them to do the right thing? Who knows? And so we have a number of synthetic experiments where we verified that indeed the estimates of the algorithm, which are the y-axis, estimate well the bias and the incompetence. And so you see diagonals here, which is a good sign. This is a bit more interesting. So here we have another synthetic experiment to test whether we could reconstruct the different school of thought of different experts or annotators. And so there are these little men, some of whom are taller and some shorter, and some are yellower and some are greener. And what we did here, and so we want to pull them apart, but there are only 2 populations. The tall ones are green and the short ones are more yellow. And so we set up a test where we asked a bunch of annotators to select the green ones and a bunch of annotators to select the tall ones. So they're selecting the same thing, but with different cues. After collecting the labels, we mix them together and we pass them on to the algorithm, who doesn't know how the annotators were instructed. And so will the algorithm be able to see a difference in behavior? So this is a variable x. Now it's 2-dimensional. And so again, x is this latent variable which tells you what are the measurements that are in the head of the annotator. So how do we interpret x? And so if you look at the ground truth, it's clear that the tall are in the high part and the short and the low part. Yellow are left and green are right. So the algorithm backed out from the data the fact that there are these two meaningful dimensions, yellow, green, tall and short. And somehow it made it explicit from purely binary labels. So it inferred this piece of information that we couldn't have possibly guessed from just the, or we could have, but with the right technique, from just the binary labels. Moreover, and so this is the ground truth. And the idea is that the points in the middle are the most ambiguous ones, the ones for which decisions are difficult. So the interesting thing is if you project down the surfaces that the annotators use for discriminating, they divide up into two groups. And if you label the lines with a color corresponding to what was told to the annotators, you see that the groups are consistent. So indeed, there is a way of finding the school of thought of experts or of annotators from the data they provide you. So from this, we see that there is a dishomogeneous set of people annotating our data. The last experiment I want to show you is less contrived. And so here we have 4 types of water birds: mallards, American black ducks, Canada geese, and redneck grebes, and then water pictures. And the task for the annotators was click on the ducks. Tell us which ones are the ducks. So this is, again, the X space, the latent space. And so God knows what these two variables mean. We couldn't quite work it out. But if you look at the ground truth, you see that all the species are separated out, apart from the 2 species of ducks, which are mixed together. Now the question is, how come, based on binary labels, which discriminate between ducks and non-ducks, the algorithm is able to pull out the grebes, the geese, and the non-water bird, and the water-only images, and separate them out? What information is it using? In principle, you shouldn't be able to do it. And so once you look at, and so indeed, if you look at the pictures on the boundary typically are quite ambiguous. So the interesting thing is to look at the annotators' surfaces. Now I come from Italy, and this looks like uncooked spaghetti dropped somewhere, not much of a structure. If you squint enough, then you start seeing a pattern. So there is a set of lines here that go through the data at a very precise point here and separate out the ducks from all the other birds. So these are the annotators who knew what they were doing. Now you have another set of lines down here, there they are, that separate out the geese from the grebes and the ducks together, and yet another set of lines here that separate out the non-bird images from the bird images. So here we have 3 schools of thought. There are annotators who know what a duck is. These are probably people who go hunting. And then there are those who confuse grebes with ducks, and then those who are completely broad in their view of what a duck is, and a goose is as good as a duck. If it quacks like a goose and it walks like a goose, it must be a duck. Okay, so so here what I've told you is if you model what is in the head of people in the proper way, you can reconstruct a lot from these noisy measurements that people give you. And so that's a good piece of news. There is a lot that can be done. And we have an application out. This is a lady who has problems sleeping, and she went to the Stanford Sleep Clinic to be analyzed. And so you spend the night lying on a bed with a few wires sticking out. and the doctors are going to monitor your breathing pattern, etc., but especially your EEG, your brain. And so you have lots of electrodes, and some channels are particularly interesting. And the next morning, the doctors have 8 hours worth of traces, and they want to find out, for example, sleep spindles. These are these rhythmic oscillations that last 1 to 2 seconds. How many were there in phase 2 sleep? This is a very important diagnostic. And then there are K-complex and other phenomena that they want to find out. For doing this job, there are professional annotators certified by a board of sleep technicians, and they spend about 3 hours to look at the trace. It turns out that automated signal processing techniques are not yet good enough for doing this job or reliable enough. So we told our friends in the sleep clinic, well, let's try with annotators on the web. We train them for 15 minutes with a very simple task where a technician gets trained for many weeks. The technician will take 10 days to give you an answer because the technician is backed up and has lots of answers, but we can run our annotators overnight. And so this is from a long paper. These annotators on the mechanical Turk are all over the place. This is a precision recall curve, slightly different from ROC, doesn't matter. The best is up here still. But you can combine them to obtain your best guess, depending on how you want to bias your detection. And this is a comparison with the true experts, the technicians. There are these red dots. And so you see that combining lots of people on the web, these are the examples of the ones who annotated most images, is almost as good or as good as having certified technicians. It costs much less, it's much quicker. And so this gives us hope that in this kind of situations, in science, in many domains where we have images and we need to get going and get stuff done, indeed we can trust the wisdom of the crowd. Lots of people who get trained a little bit. So I want to tell you one more thing before closing. So let me skip this part. So they just said that by using Bayesian statistics correctly, you can minimize the number of annotations. Let's not worry about it. And these are experiments done. So I challenged my students, okay, can we count how many taxis are there in Manhattan? And so we downloaded all the pictures from Google Maps. So it's an enormous number of pictures. And again, in a matter of an hour or two, we could count all the taxis in Manhattan up to a certain, and so these are the outputs from some annotators and so on. A slightly different application is what we call cloud clustering. Suppose that you're a scientist and you've never seen the patterns you're going to encounter, so you've built a new instrument and you're downloading new pictures. You are, for example, someone who goes out to the Amazon and photographs all the coleoptera you can find. You go with your grad students, you have 10 people for 3 months. You come home with 100,000 pictures that may look like this. What do? Well, you would like to cluster them and see what taxonomy might there be and count species and get a first rough estimate of what you might find. Now, we know how to do clustering. So we know that once you have points in some Euclidean space, or even if we have not even distances, affinity matrices, we know how to apply math to data in order to cluster it. But here we have actual pictures, and which features should we use? And experts disagree vehemently on whether 2 species of coleoptera are the same, or two items are the same species or a different one. You find people who invest 5 years to establish there are 3 types of Bembidia in Corsica instead of 2. So how are you going to employ a crowd that you can train for maybe a few minutes to carry out this task and give you some taxonomy? And this problem is all over the place. So if you try to buy a wristwatch on Amazon, I realized it when I bought this wristwatch here. So there are 67,000, there are now 80,000 wristwatches in the category of men's wristwatches. How are you going to choose? And you don't have much help from Amazon on I like this type of look, how do I find it? It's very difficult. And so this is a characteristic of the world, both man-made and natural world. How do you cluster things? And different people may have different points of view. Like these 4 watches, 2 people may cluster them this way, the white watches and the black watches. And other people may cluster them this way, the dress watches and the sports watches. Which one is the right way? Well, both are right. And so you should embrace all of the above and use it somehow to cluster in the proper way. So what are the challenges here? Well, you have a large collection, maybe 1 million images. You send it out. There is no chance that one single person quickly could look at 1 million images and classify them for you. Each person will look at a few hundred and will do some job locally. So each annotator has only a limited point of view, and so they have only a limited context on what is different and what is similar. And they have different criteria. How do you make sense of this big mess? So we thought we could do something. And here is the experiment we ran. So we collected data sets that where clustering is an interesting question. And we showed them in these 6x6 patterns to people on the web. And their task was to pick a random color each time, so blue, violet, black, and so on, and use the color they had chosen to click on images of objects that might belong to the same category. And then once they were done, repeat with a new color until they had gone through the whole display. If your picture didn't fit in any group, they would have to leave them blank. A very simple task. And so this is halfway through doing it, and you see that somebody here has decided that shoes, no matter how they're shaped, are one category, handbags are another, neckties are another, jewelry is another, etc. Now, how do we capture this idea that different people have different metrics? Well, it's simple. We just do it that way. So in this case, you could think of somebody clustering these pictures as the perched birds and the flying ones versus the birds facing left and the birds facing right. And so the idea is that different people have different metrics in their head. So there is some space where these images live, and people have different metrics. So once you have the metric, then everything else follows, because you can set up classifiers like logistic classifiers or some other way to discriminate between these different categories. So the model is very similar to what we saw before. And now, what is in the head? So there is a variable, again, zi, which is which cluster do you belong to. So this is now not binary longer, it's multi-valued.